So, Your Excellencies, colleagues, what I'd like to do is give you just the state of scientific play, which really gives the unequivocal scientific evidence that climate action, climate policy, climate risks is no longer an environmental crisis. It's really at the center of foreign policy, it's a center of geopolitics, it's a center of health, it's a center of security, and it's a center even of justice and equity around the world. We're seeing a shift in the whole agenda on not only the need to act very fast and accelerate the pathway towards a manageable, safe future, but also that we now can say that we are entering the economics, foreign policy, and broader development domains. So, I could basically summarize this talk briefly with the statement where we are in science, which we have rising evidence that climate and biosphere change, the global environmental changes we're seeing caused by us humans today, undermine the stability in societies with risks for peace, but also amplifies risks of conflict and are drivers of displacement, migration, and conflict. So science is never suggesting that climate change is causing social instability, conflict, displacement, migration, but is an amplifier and a threat cause. Now, we are today at 1.2 degrees Celsius of global warming. That's the mean temperature rise on Earth. It's the warmest temperature on Earth since we left the last ice age. And we're seeing the implications, which is exactly what is pulling the rug under the feet on vulnerable communities that are at risk of pushing themselves into instabilities that can trigger further down the line conflicts. So we have another year of extreme events across the entire world, from the droughts and forest fires in California, with the 4 consecutive rainy seasons of drought in the Horn of Africa, potentially the 5th rainy season with over 200 million people marching towards starvation, a massive risk of undermining further the vulnerable countries from Ethiopia, Somalia, Sudan, all the way down to Sudan. And then we have another year of extraordinary, extreme temperature observations in South Asia, 40 degrees Celsius over a month, with Prime Minister Modi even temporarily shutting the borders for export of grain, which amplified further the rising food prices as an effect of the Ukraine war. We suddenly see multiple impacts on the food price deviations. But what is also important to recognize is that temperatures rise above 40 degrees Celsius in India, the highest temperature ever observed in India during the 120-year record, but you also have a 70% decline in rainfall. So you have this combination of rising evaporation because of temperatures, extreme temperatures, but also less water in the rivers, causing water scarcity, impacts on farmers, impacts on the economy, and then temporarily having geopolitical consequences well beyond India. And then, of course, the big catastrophe, 30% of Pakistan underwater, which is now a devastating impact at the national level, with the World Weather Attribution Project confirming that this cannot be explained without factoring in human-caused global warming, 5 times higher monsoon rainfall than the average that we've seen over the last 200 years, a massive impact. But importantly, when we come to Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27, this will of course be one of the central stages, a question of loss and damage related to the fact that we can today scientifically prove that this would not have been possible without human-caused climate change. So we're both undermining social stability, but also distrust at a geopolitical scale. Yangtze River with an all-time low in terms of scarcity, and then of course Hurricane Ian, just to put the place that we're all seeing impacts across the entire world, a 10% increase in the extreme rainfall events factored in as caused by human-induced global warming. The price tag for this will probably be the highest cost in US history for any extreme storm event. So there is scientific support for Antonio Guterres' conclusion that we have a code red for humanity. But the code red for humanity, in his view, was only on the climate crisis. But we have an ecological crisis. We have the pandemic crisis, which interacts with the nature crisis because it's a zoonosis, it's a virus spillover from wildlife to domestic animals to humans, which all shows that you have a globalized instability which are interacting climate, health, and ecology. And to this, we need to unfortunately add the geopolitical instability in the war in Ukraine. So we are meeting here in Berlin at a moment of high degree of social ecological turbulence, which we have to take really seriously, because we're moving towards high climate risk, 2.7 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. We have scientific evidence now that going beyond even 1.5 moves us from manageable moderate risk to high risk domain. I'll give you the latest evidence for this. It comes from a paper that we produced and published just 1 month ago, 1 week before the United Nations General Assembly opening and the New York Climate Week, which gives the scientific evidence that already 1.5 is a limit. It's a point beyond which we risk triggering many of the tipping elements that regulates the state of the climate system. Here you have the map of these tipping element systems. We have today identified 16 large biophysical systems that we know contribute to regulate the stability of the climate system, but also that they have multiple stable states. Push the Amazon rainforest too far, push the Greenland ice sheet too far, and it will irreversibly shift and drift off towards a state that is less able to support humanity and thereby risk further instability in societies. Now, the assessment is when we put all the science together with the confidence level shown here in these red embers ranges, but the dotted lines is where you should focus. That's the average assessment levels. What you find is that a set of these tipping element systems, as you see furthest to the left, are at risk already at 1.5 degrees. And you won't see it from where you're sitting, but let me just read out. The 4 furthest to the left is the Greenland ice sheet, the West Antarctic ice sheet, tropical coral reef systems, which are home to over 150 million people, and abrupt thawing of permafrost in the boreal region in the northern hemisphere. Just the Greenland ice sheet and the West Antarctic ice sheet together holds 10-meter sea level rise, which is likely to cross irreversible thresholds at 1.5. This gives, tremendous scientific support that now is the time to move really fast towards decarbonizing the world economy, because otherwise we get not only the extreme events, but also this longer-term sliding. Of course, the Greenland ice sheet doesn't melt overnight. It might take 500 years, but it's irreversible. We stand in front of a risk of already 2-meter sea level rise this century. That's why we need a planetary boundary framework that guides us scientifically within a safe operating space where we can have stable societies. We've identified 9 planetary boundaries, where climate is only one. And I won't go through all the 9, of course, but the key message is that among these 9, you also have what I call the biosphere boundaries. Biodiversity, fresh water, nitrogen, phosphorus, land composition, the living nature, which provides us with a buffering capacity to absorb shocks, to keep carbon stocks intact, to keep freshwater supplies stable, to enable food production, to have stable energy and temperature, to avoid heat waves that we cannot manage. So the IPCC has come to the conclusion of connecting these dots together. And this is one of the high-level statements in the 6th assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, concluding that global warming at the levels we're seeing today is causing extreme events, but also increasing vulnerability with risks of triggering violent interstate conflict. So as you see, the science is advancing. I mean, I mentioned this particularly because the IPCC, as you know, is the consensus across the entire climate scientific community. It's like the baseline that we all agree on, which is now moving the science into geopolitics. We have in the Weathering Risk project that we're working together with Adelphi, supported by the Foreign Office, here where we are right now, mapping out fragility and risks of displacement and social conflicts due to the correlations between fragility and vulnerability of nation states. This is no big surprise, but we have a very strong set of evidence today that fragile states with vulnerable citizens, combined with often being the #1 victims of climate impacts, of course creates a form of perfect storm for the risk of being pushed into situations of social instability. In ongoing work, we're showing that displacement within countries on the x-axis, which increases to the right, spills over also to increasing migration internationally. This has often been a question mark. We see a dominance of internal displacement. That is what dominantly happens under conflict, under disasters. But we also see more and more evidence that it also spills over to international migration and movement of people across national borders. We have, therefore, the risk right now with the Ukraine war and the challenges with regard to food security of the impacts in one of the hotspot areas, which is in the Horn of Africa, which is now subject to both drought, 4 consecutive rainy seasons that have failed, massive amounts of starvation and poverty and fragility, but also the impacts of the world food market being increasingly working against supporting these vulnerable communities. And if anything, we need to really take these hotspot situations very seriously. These risks will definitely multiply, unfortunately, in the future because we're not yet seeing the bending of the curves. So, for example, in Somalia, IPCC predicts that temperatures will continue rising, that we'll see rising number of days being at the heat wave level that are difficult for vulnerable communities to cope with. We have a quite recent study, which is summarized here, which I find to be one of the most profound risk assessments that we have. What you see here in color are the risk assessments of economies and population. So the yellow and red areas here are the most populated, and also those economies that are at a higher vulnerability level. And the dashed lines here, you may not see it so well, are the regions that within 50 years will have at least 30 degrees Celsius of global mean temperature level over the year. And that's a health threshold. Beyond that point, we risk threats for human health, even mortality. And I'll just summarize the regions for you because you don't see it so well, but we're talking of large parts of Latin America, the whole of West Africa and the Horn of Africa, the Middle East, the entire parts of India and Southeast Asia. 3.5 billion people within 50 years living in regions where the vulnerable people will have no choice but to move, because it's simply environments that will be too hot for health. And this is only on temperature. It has nothing to do with water or food. So it just shows that when we see these kind of media focus arising increasingly, and you pose the question whether there's scientific evidence behind it, we cannot put all scientific evidence behind it. It's really still a complex research question, but there's more and more support for the need to connect the understanding on climate risks with instabilities in societies. So we are working very hard on this to improve the understanding of interactions between climate, conflict, and insecurity. We need to systematically address these risks and be able to foresight. That's what we're working on right now. Can we foresight future hotspot and risks and identify them as early warning systems and really connect this not only with the environmental agenda, but in particular with the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. That keeping ourselves away from climate risks that can lead to conflict is, of course, the only way to have a chance of having more harmonious delivery on the aspirations we have on social and economic development. So this is what we're working on in the Weathering Risk project between the Potsdam Institute and Adelphi, to try and replicate climate security risk assessments, to develop a methodology of how to link all these data sets on social, ecological, and climate risks, to do this across different timescales, and to develop methods that can plug right into the work that I guess many of you are involved in, which is really on the foreign policy, on the action on the ground. What investments do we have to take? What political decisions do we have to take? What policies do we need to be able to build resilience in a situation where we're rapidly losing it because of these multiple drivers of change? So with that, I just want to put this last slide on what we know is climate-related events do affect risks of conflict. They are multiplying and likely to continue to do that in the future. We have a lot still that we need to understand in order to know where things will happen in the future, but we've come a significant way along this line, and I'm really enthusiastic to see that this dialogue is now really entering the center stage of foreign policy and development around the world. Climate is a risk and it has to be abated. Thank you very much.